Jesus died because of sin. It becomes a little bit abstract because actually we don't have all that strong a concept of sin these days. There was a time in the past where the awfulness of sin was at the forefront of people's consciousness. They could be brought to a very strong conviction of how dirty and rotten they were and how in need of forgiveness and cleansing they were. However, that's seldom the case today. In this day and age, we seem to have a much more free and easy approach to sin. Everyone makes mistakes. Overall, I'm pretty good. I try my best, sort of thing. The trouble is, we need a strong sense of sin, our sinfulness, in order to recognise our need of Jesus as Saviour. If there's nothing wrong, then what the heck do you need a Saviour for? Jesus died to save us from our sins becomes nothing more than an empty religious phrase to repeat, paraphrasing, unless we understand the reality of sin. Jesus didn't just die for our little white lies, our petty jealousy, selfishness, or over-prioritising material things in life. Nope. Jesus was actually killed by human sinfulness, the sinfulness residing in human hearts today. Jesus died because sin killed him, and then he defeated sin by rising from the grave. But let's look at the kinds of sinfulness that existed then and now, the darkness of humanity, the different shades of darkness humanity is capable of. It's seen mainly in Matthew chapter 27. We'll start with Judas. Open and shut case, isn't it? Judas the traitor who turned against Jesus after seeing all the good Jesus had done. When I was a teenager, I got really into the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar. There's a line where the character Judas sings, "Just don't say I'm damned for all time." Jesus actually said, "For the Son of Man must die, as the Scriptures declared long ago. But how terrible it will be for the one who betrays him. It will be far better for that man if he had never been born. And I guarded them so that no one was lost, except the one headed for destruction, as the Scriptures were told." Back then I wondered, the Scriptures declared Jesus had to be betrayed, so someone had to do it. Was it unfair to Judas that since someone had to do it, that he bear such a dreadful punishment? Let's see what kind of a person Judas was. When Judas, who had betrayed him, realised that Jesus had been condemned to die, he was filled with remorse. He took the 30 pieces of silver back to the leading priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he declared, "for I have betrayed an innocent man." "What do we care?" they retorted. "That's your problem." And then Judas threw the silver coins down in the temple and went out and hanged himself. Judas has made a terrible mistake, and too late he realises what he's done. It's almost sympathetic to the man, it seems. What was he like? We get an insight in John 12 when a woman comes to Jesus and anoints Jesus' feet with a large quantity of precious perfume. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, "That perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor, he was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. The darkness of humanity in Judas is that he is a do-gooder, well-meaning, high-minded ideals, but unrealistic and interfering. He talks about helping the poor, but in actual fact, he's a hypocrite because he only helps the poor with other people's money and really helps himself to the money he's put in charge of. I want to avoid politics here, and it is rather too difficult, therefore, to bring in any examples. However, our world is riddled with this do-gooder hypocrisy. We see all manner of legitimate causes, like Judas's the poor, championed by all manner of seemingly well-motivated individuals. But fundamentally, there's a great dishonesty at the heart of it all. We see it in the urges for decriminalisation of euthanasia or recreational drug use, at the same time as suicide and drug harm escalate and the damage they do to society. And we see it in the number of vocal opponents of sexual abuse, who then are exposed as guilty of sexual harassment themselves. It was interesting to observe that back in 2016, when the North Shore Times ran stories about Bruce, a homeless man who lived behind the church for a few years, and his dog Bud. It wasn't a poor homeless man that aroused all the sympathy and reaction. It was the dog that got all the sympathy. It's as far as I can go without entering a political debate. Causes are good. The environment, child poverty, refugees, racism, victims of abuse, human rights, and the poor. But I want to say, the do-gooder, the champion riding the bandwagon, the advocate of causes is far too often a sham. Instead, that person is actually motivated by their own selfishness, and they betray the very causes that they espouse. What Judas really meant by his apology in Matthew 27 is that he's still justifying himself. He's still filled with hypocrisy and self-righteousness. His remorse comes in that he's caught by surprise at the hypocrisy of his own actions. One of the very great darknesses of humanity today is how very easy it is to proclaim a cause and use that to justify selfishness and envy. Proclaiming to the end the purity of one's motives, even in the face of the obvious evidence of betrayal of that very cause. Maybe in this I've been too obscure and you don't see what I mean. But open your eyes, it's all around us. And that same betrayal killed Jesus. Judas the traitor is actually a do-gooder. Here in this passage, we also see another darkness of humanity, the priests. What do we care? They retorted. That's your problem. The leading priests picked up the coins. It wouldn't be right to put this money in the temple treasury, they said, since it was payment for murder. After some discussion, they finally decided to buy the potter's field, and they made that into a cemetery for foreigners. That is why the field is still called the Field of Blood. This fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah that says they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price at which he was valued by the people of Israel, and purchased the potter's field as the Lord directed. Some people do have evil in their hearts, but of course it's hidden from sight deep within. On the outside, they're respectable, upstanding, self-righteous. Inside is murder. The leading priests, the teachers of the religious law, and the elders also mocked Jesus. He saved others, they scoffed, but he can't save himself. So he is the King of Israel, is he? Let him come down from the cross right now and we'll believe in him. He trusted God, so let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. As Jesus had said, but when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is. There are people filled with evil in their hearts. They are consumed with hate, with revenge, with desire to see others destroyed out of jealousy or fear. I confess I'm not often good at picking the genuine evil at heart. As Christian counsellors, pastors and people helpers, we often have a hard time discerning between an evil heart and an ordinary sinner who messed up, who isn't perfect and full of weakness and sin. The person who wrote that gives 5 indicators that you may be dealing with an evil heart rather than an ordinary sinful heart, which requires radically different treatment and approach. Firstly, evil hearts are experts at creating confusion and contention. They twist facts, mislead, lie, and avoid responsibility. Secondly, evil hearts are experts at fooling others with smooth speech and flattering words, but it's all smoke and mirrors. Thirdly, evil hearts crave and demand control, and their highest authority is their own self-reference. They cannot accept feedback or accountability. Fourthly, evil hearts play on the sympathies of goodwill people. They demand mercy, warmth, forgiveness, and intimacy, but give none back in return. Evil hearts, lastly, have no conscience and no remorse. They delight in evil. It's the classic picture of, say, a serial killer. But such like people, these priests, for instance, can be found anywhere, even in churches. Perhaps they even seek churches where there are easy victims. In the darkness of humanity lies those whose hearts are bent on inflicting pain and murder upon others. Jesus died at their hands too. The darkness in the hearts of the religious authorities is particularly a major theme of Matthew's Gospel. Matthew frequently shows Jesus condemning the religious authorities and takes pains to emphasise how the outward pretense of religion and looking good doesn't fool God. As the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The biblical view is that the main culprits, the instigators and the drivers behind Jesus' execution, were these religious authorities motivated by hatred. Hatred, and particularly hatred of God, are prevalent and just as malevolent today. However, the picture presented in many of the Christian movies that have come out in recent times is, rather than the Jewish authorities, religious authorities being the main villains, they're meaningfully well-intended but misguided victims of Roman occupation and oppression. How does this square with the Bible? Now, Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. "Are you the king of the Jews?" the governor asked him. "Don't you hear these charges they're bringing against you?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. Now, it was the governor's custom each year to release one prisoner to the crowd, anyone they wanted. As the crowds gathered before Pilate's house that morning, he asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" He knew very well that the religious authorities had arrested Jesus out of envy. Just then, as Pilate was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife sent him this message: "Leave that innocent man alone. I suffered through a terrible nightmare about him last night." They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate, it seems, is convinced there's no case to answer, and yet he still feels free to later condemn Jesus. There is another darkness to humanity. That is the evil of institutional forces in action. Institutions, that's organisations, bureaucracies and authority structures, are human creations. They mostly start off with a lofty goal and intent, to help people, to do good, to control problems, but later become self-serving, dead in their own rules, working against their own very intent. It is a very great irony that of all the institutions, organisations, authorities that exist in this country, the one that requires multiple security guards at its doors to protect its staff from its clients is the one created specifically to help people wins work and income. The very organisation intended to help the disadvantaged in society so antagonises them that it has to protect itself against those it's supposed to be helping. It is Pontius Pilate's dilemma. His conscience wants to do the right thing, but political considerations, balancing of pressures and lobbying interests, the need to survive the present crisis, the entrenchment of other interests, and the more important cause him to condemn an innocent man to death. Furthermore, he eventually glimpses the much greater issue underlying the mistake he is making, from John's Gospel this time. The Jewish leaders replied, "By our law, he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. People in places of institutional power, people like us even, who are basically good, well-intentioned people, do terrible things in the name of the institution they represent. Yet institutions, like people, can sometimes resist darkness. People in institutional roles can sometimes go against the flow. Take a Roman centurion, an important officer in that institution, the Roman military. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and he said to those following him, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Sometimes, in fact, the purpose of most institutions is to surpass the darkness of humanity, a deep vision of good. This centurion demands nothing of Jesus, but surpasses anyone else around in understanding Jesus can heal at a word without having to even be present or be inconvenienced. Just so, at the heart of organisations and institutions, mostly will be found people with genuine compassion, true understanding, actual answers. Yet more often than not, these people are not the face nor the instigator of actions that come out of human institutions. Rather, instead, we see in Pilate the darkness of humanity such that he condemns Jesus to death, regardless of the fact he knows it's wrong. Then there is yet another kind of evil. Some of the governor's soldiers took Jesus into their headquarters and called out the entire regiment. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. They wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head, and they placed a reed stick in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat on him and grabbed the stick and struck him on the head with it. And when they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the robe and they put on his own clothes on him again, and then they led him away to be crucified. Along the way, they came across a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. And then they went out to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. The soldiers gave Jesus wine mixed with bitter gall, but when he had tasted it, he refused to drink it. After they'd nailed him to the cross, the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. Then they sat around and kept guard as he hung there. Callous brutality. When great evil arises, there never seems to be a shortage of people to unthinkingly carry out atrocities and cruelties. We look around us and most people seem basically decent enough, holding moral, normal values and roles in society. And yet, when a society falls under the spell of great evil, say the communism of Lenin, Stalin or Mao, or the various ethnic genocides, then there's never a shortage of thugs, prison guards or bullies, and never any restraint in their actions either. So let's not think that there aren't people today who would too have taken advantage of innocent Jesus to torment him and abuse him, somehow for their own gratification. Why and how does belittling another person make some people feel, I don't know what they feel. Yet bullying and the kind of indifference that lets people toss dice for Jesus' robe right under his feet as he dies a painful death is endemic in our society today too. Even when they see the truth, it doesn't really stop them. The Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened, and they said, this man truly was the Son of God. You don't see anyone giving the robes back or saying sorry, do you? Brutality still kills Jesus. But there is another last darkness of humanity. Just as the crowd bayed for blood in front of Pilate, the people passed by shouting abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. Look at you now, they yelled at him. You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Well then, if you're the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross. The crowd shouting abuse. What are they? They are followers of fashion, a bunch of headless chickens running around in circles. What did Jesus say about these people of Jerusalem? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers. How often I have wanted to gather your children together as a hen protects her chicks beneath her wings, but you wouldn't let me. And now look, your house is abandoned and desolate. For I tell you this, you will never see me again until you say, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. These people killed Jesus, and yet Jesus wanted nothing more than to draw them to himself and protect them from themselves. There's a song line from Peter Gabriel: we do what we're told what we do. Far too often, people think what they are told to think through perceived public opinion instead of thinking for themselves. These crowds are as guilty of Jesus' death as any of those more directly involved: Judas, the priests, Pilate, or a bunch of soldiers. Pilate saw he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water. He washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours. And the people yelled back, we will take responsibility for his death, we and our children. Jesus died because of the crowd mentality, that phenomenon where individuals get swept up by the tide to simply go along with the flow. How different would it have been if the people of Jerusalem demanded justice rather than retribution for imagined offence? How different if the people had sought after Jesus instead of rejecting him? How different if the people had been seeking God rather than self-serving? How different if the people had been obedient to God instead of being swayed by every sanctimonious, self-righteous sensitivity. Jesus died because of the darkness that lies in human hearts. Jesus died because we killed him. Whether it was the hypocritical do-gooders among us who claim the high moral ground but without any real light or truth, whether it was those few with actual malice and evil in their hearts, whether it was those who are caught up in systems and institutions that cause them to act against their individual inclinations, whether it was the innate brutality that's ready to erupt from beneath the surface of so many people, or whether it was the crowd of headless chickens caught up in the fervour to turn against an innocent. People killed Jesus. People just like us. Let's not for a moment imagine anything has changed since those days. If anything, our more complicated world has made all these things far worse. Jesus died because of human sin, our sin. This crucifixion death wasn't merely an indirect corollary such that Jesus had to die some way in order to pay the penalty for sin. No, the sinful nature of people actually killed Jesus. Jesus suffered the consequences of the darkness that lies within humanity. And then he rose again, such that that darkness could not overcome the light which was within Jesus. And that light will and can overcome the darkness that lies within each of us. God's light came into the world. But people love the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it, for fear their sins will be exposed. But those who do what is right come to the light, so others can see that they are doing what God wants. Let's pray. Father, make us conscious of the sin that lies within us, in order that we might know the Saviour who brings light to overcome the darkness. Let us know that we too were capable of killing Jesus, the Son of God, the one we proclaim now as Lord. Let us live completely different lives, that we might be transformed and that sin might be overcome in our lives by that light which Jesus brings. Let us draw near to him, that he might cleanse us and expel that sin, that darkness of humanity. that we might be radically different people. Praise your name. Amen.